Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Angelina Godoy, and I am the Helen H. Jackson Chair in Human Rights here at the University of Washington and the director of our Center for Human Rights. So thank you so much for being here, all of you. I'm here tonight to present our center's two latest research reports about deportation flights on ICE Air, both nationally and from King County. Those reports are also available online, and I encourage you to consult them there and share them widely. We're also here today to hear from three distinguished panelists, and I want to welcome them as community leaders with rich perspectives to share about the importance of these issues. They are also people who contributed directly to the research that we are here today presenting, so in many ways their insights have already enriched our perspectives that are brought forward in the reports themselves. I want to go ahead and introduce them right now. I apologize, we're having them sit here where you can see them while I introduce them, mainly because there's a blinding light from the projector that would hit them right exactly at eye level, and we want them to survive this encounter this evening, so they will come up and speak in turn. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce them in the order that they will be speaking, which is the same order as on the poster and promotional material for this event. So I will speak first, and I'll present our research, and then I will hand it over to Hamdi Mohammed. Hamdi was born the youngest of 10 siblings in Mogadishu, Somalia, and a year later she fled Somalia with her family as the Civil War broke out. She came to the United States when she was 3 years old. Today, Hamdi is a graduate of the University of Washington with a degree in Law, Societies, and Justice. Any LSJ people out there? And she splits her work. She works for Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and she splits her work in Congresswoman Jayapal's district office and her campaign office. In the district office, Hamdi is the director of constituent services, where she helps people navigate the everyday impacts of public policy and addresses constituents' issues relating to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Department of State. And in that capacity, she has been extraordinarily helpful to us here at the Human Rights Center. She's also often finding herself writing letters for stay of removal for those facing deportation and requesting expedited adjudications on immigration applications, so she's intimately familiar with the concerns that arise in those processes. Part of her job is also educating and acting as a conduit between citizens and federal agencies. She's also Congresswoman Jayapal's campaign manager and is responsible for overseeing all aspects of the campaign, the management of staff, the coordination and implementation of all fundraising operations. So she's got a lot on her plate, and we're very, very lucky to have her not only representing us here in this congressional district, but here with us tonight to share her perspectives on these issues. After that, we will hear from Buntai Chim, who's a 1.5 generation Khmer American, born in the Khao Idan refugee camp. He describes himself as a Holly baby, or a past resident of Holly Park, the predecessor to today's New Holly neighborhood in southeast Seattle. Buntai is a storyteller, and he focuses on centering the voices of marginalized communities in his work. To that end, he has told stories through poetry, as an actor on stage and in film, as a playwright, and through journalism. His articles have appeared on Crosscut, the Seattle Globalist, the South Seattle Emerald, and the International Examiner, where he was part of the inaugural cohort for their Advocacy Journalism Fellowship Program. He's also a community organizer with the Khmer Anti-Deportation Advocacy Group of Washington, and he also volunteers for the Cambodian American Community Council of Washington and the Coalition of Immigrant Refugees and Communities of Color. So also a person who can speak with great expertise to the issues that arise in the context of deportations right here in King County. And lastly, we will be hearing from Maru Mora Villalpando. Maru is an activist and an undocumented immigrant. She was born and raised in Mexico City, and here in the United States, she has spent many years focusing on racial justice and immigrant rights. Currently, she leads La Resistencia, the organization formerly known as Northwest Detention Center Resistance, where the group's main focus is to shut down the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma while gaining better treatment and conditions for all undocumented immigrants held there. Maru has been an outspoken activist and has been upfront about staying in the United States after her visa expired. And in December of last year, in direct retaliation for that outspokenness, Immigration and Customs Enforcement put her in deportation proceedings. Despite these challenges, Marumora is undeterred and she continues her advocacy work, and she was recently selected as the 2018 Globalist of the Year at the Seattle Globalist Film Globee Awards celebration. But when she asked how she would describe herself, she said, "I'm a single mom and a community organizer." So I'm very grateful to all three of those folks for being here. And then there's another set of folks I want to acknowledge with particular gratitude. They are too numerous for me to introduce each of them with all of their qualifications, but those qualifications shine throughout the work that the Center for Human Rights has published on this issue. All of our work at the Center for Human Rights is powered by student researchers, and this project is no exception. So the research reports that we are presenting tonight draw heavily on research conducted by undergraduate members of a Jackson School task force that I taught last quarter, most of whom are here tonight. That's Task Force D. Will you guys stand up and let us acknowledge you? Thank you. Okay, so no more introductions. Before I dig into the research that I keep saying I'm going to talk about, I want to also acknowledge something else that many of you may already have heard because it was front page news. Yesterday, Dow Constantine, King County executive, issued an executive order expressing his intention, his goal, of banning all deportation flights by private charters at Boeing Field. That deserves a round of applause. So some people have asked me how that changes what we're going to talk about. That executive order came as a huge surprise to me yesterday, as some of you who were with me in the moment I received the news know. You could have pushed me over with a feather. So does this change what we're going to talk about? Well, actually, from my point of view, it doesn't. The executive order is long on vision. It embraces a beautiful vision that I'm happy to get behind. It's bold and beautiful, and it articulates with eloquence King County values, but it's very short on specifics. It commands, for example, county officials to take all appropriate measures to limit collaboration with deportation flights. That sounds good. What are those appropriate measures? The devil is always in the details. And so that's what I believe makes tonight's discussion more important than ever, right? And ongoing research and advocacy on these issues is more important than ever. That executive order is the first of its kind in the nation. So now it's on us to make sure we do not rest until the bold principles and visions articulated there are brought down to concrete policies, and we stop those flights because the entire rest of the country is watching for us to show them it can be done. So how do we do this? Well, first, we have to learn how the flights work. And that's where the intimate and boring details that I'm about to expose you to come in. That's what I want to talk about tonight. And then we have to learn to fight like hell. And I think we have three excellent panelists that can tell us how to do that and give us lots of tips and enlist our services in following them forward in that task. So, with no further ado, let me take you into the machinery of mass deportation that is ICE Air. And before I do that, I want to say a few words about how we got this work underway to begin with. So we began this research in 2018 in response to requests from community partners, indeed some of the partners that are here today or that are represented here today, because members of immigrant communities here in King County have long known about deportation flights happening at King County International Airport or Boeing Field, right? Folks know that their family members are taken there and shipped out of the country. And many have long wondered, how is this possible if Boeing Field is a publicly owned and administered airport and we are supposedly a sanctuary county, indeed one of the most progressive sanctuary ordinances in the nation? How is this happening? So that was our first research puzzle that we set out to investigate, and it's still reflected in the report's title of Hidden in Plain Sight. In a way, there's sort of a paradox around deportations that we learned as we did this work. You know, we all know deportations are happening. Our president mentions them on the daily. Everybody knows there are flights taking people to other countries all the time. You can go to Boeing Field and see with the naked eye images like this, which was taken just weeks ago by one of our student photographers. You can track the flights online if you have access to the internet. Anybody can. It's an open secret. It's not a surprise. And yet, strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, the mechanisms by which people were being placed on those planes, the business relationships through which people are profiting from the moving of bodies into those planes and across the country and out of the country, had remained largely secret and shrouded in secrecy until now. And that's why we think this research is important, and this particular moment is important to talk about those mechanisms. So we started out by filing a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and through that last year we obtained a copy of ICE's Alien Repatriation Tracking System. It's a database that contains over 1.7 million records. Each of those records, and you can scroll through it and keep scrolling through it and keep scrolling through it and keep scrolling through it, and each of them represents an individual person shackled at hands and feet and dragged across a tarmac and forced onto a plane somewhere in the United States between fiscal year 2011 and fiscal year 2019. So when we first got that database, which ICE itself gave to us through FOIA, we then complemented that with public records requests in 4 different US states and 3 different foreign countries, a raft of interviews, and the analysis of publicly available documents. And the very hard work of the students you recognized earlier was made it possible for us to draw the conclusions that we are sharing with you tonight. So what this map here shows is the ICE air flight paths within the United States. These are paths taken by private planes, chartered through a web of public and private relationships that profits off the detention and deportation of migrants. And we have a whole report on the national data and what that reveals, but I want to save the time I have, the brief time I have with you tonight, to talk specifically about what it tells us about what's happening here in King County. So this chart refers to King County. During this same period, from 2010 to 2019, almost 35,000 people were directly deported through Boeing Field. And as you can see in these numbers, the rate of deportations through Boeing Field fluctuates over time. These numbers map roughly, or the rates map roughly onto national figures. But on average, 350 passengers were removed from King County International Airport every month. So where do those flights go? Well, some of them are direct removals. There have been flights that leave Boeing Field and land in Guatemala or in China. But most, the overwhelming majority, in fact, are indirect flights. They're transfers to deportation hubs that ICE maintains, just like United Airlines or American. They all have their hubs. Well, ICE's hubs are along the southern border or in the southern states of the United States. There's 5 different hubs. You can see some of them reflected here on the map. From those hubs, they're either placed on another plane and flown abroad, or in the case of Mexican nationals, they're often bused directly across the border. And also some people are relocated to another detention center. So from these places, some people are taken to be locked up in another part of the United States. And in this way, it's impossible to separate the flights from the detention centers themselves. This is a window into the profit-making enterprise of housing and moving bodies. And there's also flights coming into Boeing Field. Now, those flights tend to be lighter in terms of passengers because this is the business of deportation, but there's also people being brought into our county, presumably to fill beds at the Northwest Detention Center, where, as you may know, there's a bed quota of 800 people per day, providing an incentive, therefore, for ICE to shuffle people around the country in order to fill those beds. So as this map shows, where are people coming to KBFI or Boeing Field? They're coming from those border areas. What this means is that the border is here. It's right here. So when you read the news about what's happening on the border, when you read about family separations and children being pried from their parents' arms and asylum seekers being incarcerated, those people, they're coming here. And so we shouldn't afford ourselves the luxury of thinking that because we live in progressive King County, those issues aren't happening here. They are. And that's what this data shows. Our county is intricately enmeshed in a national network of deportation and incarceration and providing a platform for profit-making from those processes. Now, the bulk of the detainees, or deportees, if you will, are from Mexico and the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, often referred to as the Northern Triangle of Central America. By overwhelming numbers, those are the majority of those who are being deported. But we also see growing numbers of deportees in particularly just the last couple of years from other long-standing communities in King County. including Cambodians, Somalians, and many others who came in some cases as resettled refugees, only now, decades later, to face deportation. There are many, many human rights concerns that arise in this process, and the data that we have gathered sheds new light on some of them. As some of you may have heard, there are accounts of, few and far between, but there are accounts of atrocious physical violence transpiring on the planes themselves. The most famous of these is the account of a failed deportation flight in December 2017 to Somalia that wound up, didn't even make it all the way to Somalia, but in Senegal it stopped and was held on the tarmac for 23 hours, during which time the detainees remained shackled, as they do on all these flights, for the entire time. They were physically beaten. Some of them were dragged down the aisle of the plane. Others were tasered. Some were put in full body restraints that detainees describe as body bags. Others were subjected to other forms of physical violence, denied access to the restroom. Some were forced to soil themselves in their seats. What's unusual about that flight is that it returned to the United States. It went so drastically wrong that ICE decided to turn the plane around and bring those folks back to the US, and many of them filed a lawsuit as a result. That's what makes it unusual, because we know about it. There is no mechanism by which passengers on other flights can report what happened to them. We have no way of knowing how common those accounts of that Somali flight are. Of the interviews that we conducted, we heard about routinely racist, degrading treatment, even here on the tarmac of Boeing Field. So I think we shouldn't focus only on these egregious accounts of physical abuse, not only because we don't know how widespread they are, but because it obscures the violence that is deportation itself. Right? Family separation is deportation. The wrenching of people from their family members and forcing them onto planes to a country that many of them have never even known is a form of violence. And this data sheds new light on due process concerns that often arise in that process. Strikingly, in fact, ICE's own database contains a column titled Status, where they register the deportability of the individual in question in a series of alphanumeric codes. And through our analysis of those codes, we found that of the people deported from King County, some 157 on direct removal flights were being removed despite having pending appeals before the US courts. That means those deportations are unlawful. Those people have not exhausted their legal process in the United States, and they're nonetheless being put on a plane. And when I asked immigration attorneys about this, they all knew cases like that. It's not rare. In fact, that 157 is probably a drastic undercount because, as I said before, so many of the flights are internal transfers, and we're being conservative with these numbers, only counting direct removals. In addition, some 2,615 people deported through Boeing Field had no access to the courts whatsoever throughout their process. This should not surprise us. Most of the people being deported in this country now are deported through a variety of processes called expedited removal and associated with expedited removal, which means they are never entitled to a hearing for judicial review of their case, for a judge to hear what happened. And this is all inscribed in the data that we reviewed. So how does this happen? Well, this is a complex chart that we took a lot of time trying to figure out ways to clarify, to show the relationships between private and public entities that make this possible right here in King County. I want to be clear, the county itself does not have a contract with ICE, but what the county does is it rents space to private companies, which are called FBOs, or fixed base operators. They have hangar space at King County Airport, and this is true at other airports throughout the nation. King County is not unusual. Clay Lacy Aviation, which has recently been bought by Modern Aviation, is the principal FBO involved in profiting from deportation flights, which are carried out by private charters at King County International Airport. Those FBOs are the entities that are profiting from the flights, which are contracted through a series of contracting and subcontracting relationships. So you see ICE there at the top. They have a single air charter broker called Classic Air Charter, which is in charge of organizing and coordinating all of these flights across the nation and the world. They, in turn, hire private companies to run the planes, to staff the planes, to shackle the folks being put on them, and to provide all the associated support with that process. Those companies in turn do business with FBOs like here at King County Airport, Clay Lacy, and the airport itself derives income from those companies' rental of hangar space to facilitate those activities, as well as from landing fees and fuel charges associated with deportation flights. And the airport, King County, is legally responsible for overseeing their operations, ensuring that they are safe and lawful. Yeah, as we learned in this process, you can see here this is just one example of an invoice filed by King County to Swift Air, which is the #1 private charter operator in this segment of the U.S. market. The county has conducted no inspections, no audits of these companies' operations, despite the fact that they have the right to do so under the terms of their contract. They routinely renew leases for as long as 35 years without having ever engaged in any effective oversight of their practices. So I'm gratified to hear that the county is expressing an intention to change that. The fact that their records, however, are so sorely lacking, or that their process of making public the records that they may have, leads us to be cautious about embracing those intentions until we see concrete results. This is just a screenshot from one of the databases that we are working with, in which I cross-checked or cross-referenced the ICE Air database that we got from ICE with the records we got from King County about flights coming in and departing from King County. And what you're seeing there on all those yellow bars are flights that ICE records show went through King County and that King County claims it has no records of. But as I said, you can track this all on the web. In fact, somebody set up a Twitter account that enables you to, and I would suggest you follow it, because in the days that come, there will be more deportation flights. There was one yesterday. There may be another one later this week. There'll certainly be one next week. Well, I shouldn't say certainly, these things are unpredictable, but there's likely to be one next week. And I think we need to be aware of this. I think we need to be demanding results from the county, and no better way to do that than to make ourselves aware through our own trustworthy mechanisms of what's happening. This is one way to do it. You can get notifications sent directly to your phone. Please follow it. Sorry?
What's the handle?
The handle is ICE Air KBFI. I will leave my comments there, although I look forward to any questions or comments that others might have, but I want to give time to my esteemed colleagues to come up and speak. So please join me in welcoming Hamdi Mohammed.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to say thank you to Professor Godoy and the UW Center for Human Rights for the hard work that you guys have been doing, and for shining a light and exposing the harsh conditions that folks are going through. It is so important that this work is being done, that we expose U.S. Immigration, Customs, and Border Patrol, enforcement, ICE. I see my old professors in this room. Professor Steve Herbert and Catherine Buckett is in here. And it feels like a full circle graduating from the University of Washington and being in this room today. I just want to say that because it's flowing through my head as I speak. That said, I'm glad to be here to be discussing something very important and something very personal to me, is deportations to Somalia. As you guys heard, I came to the U.S. as a refugee when I was 3 years old, and fled Somalia with my family. And so to be covering this it's very personal and very close to my heart. Somalia has been affected by decades of civil war, political violence, and humanitarian crisis. Today, Al-Shabaab, which is a known terrorist group, has used many forms of violence to take control of the region. And they've been doing that since 2006. On October 14, 2017, Mogadishu, the capital city of Somalia, experienced one of the deadliest terrorist attacks that has been seen in the recent history of the world. The Associated Press reported that 500 people were killed, 300 wounded. Just last month, in 1 week, there were 7 different car bombings that happened in Mogadishu. In the last few years, the country has experienced what has been called the worst droughts and famines in the 21st century. So if you guys see on the State Department website, it says, do not travel to Somalia due to crime, terrorism, kidnapping, and piracy. It is a level 4 country, which is basically the highest threat level a country can be scaled at. But despite the warnings issued by our U.S. Department of State, ICE is continuing to deport folks there. In a report that was released to our office by ICE, it showed that over 500 individuals were deported to Somalia in 2017. That number was triple the number from 2016. Many of the individuals who are being deported were raised in refugee camps outside of Somalia and sought asylum in the United States as refugees who were fleeing persecution and violence. Many of the individuals have family members who live here in the United States. They've lived in the United States for decades themselves. Some of the folks who have been deported to Somalia do not even speak the language. They're not fluent in Somali anymore because they've been here since they were kids and don't have family connections there anymore, which make them very vulnerable to militant violence. Somalia is experiencing food, water crisis that compromise human rights, in addition to overwhelming turmoil and conflict. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee has urged countries to refrain from forcibly removing individuals who have entered a country as a refugee back to Somalia, specifically, actually. They say that any area that has been affected by military action or is ensuing displacement remains fragile or insecure after military action or remains under or partial control of non-state armed groups. And that's essentially what Mogadishu is. But ICE is continuing to deport folks there. Due to the conditions in the region, these deportations are violating the following human rights treaty and customary laws: the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, which basically says that a refugee should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their life and freedom, as well as the UN Convention Against Torture, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly to promote the respect of individual civil and political rights among all committed parties, the United States. And those rights include the right to life, the right to freedom, and also the right to due process and fair trial. And that's one of the things that we're seeing now happening, is where folks are being deported when they have pending appeals in court. Today, many Somali refugees, as you heard Professor Godoy say, allege that U.S. immigration authorities have treated them with cruelty on deportation flights. And you guys have to think, like, these flights to Somalia are not short flights. It's 24-hour travel times we're talking about. They are reporting being kept in handcuffs, being shackled without food, water, limited access to lavatory or no access. In a court document, a fellow Somali deportee states, and I quote, when the plane's toilets overfilled with human waste, some of the detainees were left to urine in bottles or on themselves. In a BBC report, a fellow Somali deportee alleges they all experienced the following abuses, and I quote, being maced with the gas, being threatened to be killed. While we were in shackles, they were just throwing us against the wall and on the ground. Many of the folks who have been deported, like I said, have family members who are U.S. citizens, right? And their family members are not even being notified of when these flights are gonna take off. They don't know when the deportation flight dates are. They can't even say bye or make any sort of plans for wherever that person may be going. And that's a problem. A U.S. citizen mother shared with me her personal story about her son being deported to Mogadishu, which she essentially described as a death sentence. She said he had no money, no one to welcome him there. She was devastated. She was in tears. And then she asked me if I could imagine what it would be like just being blindfolded and being put on a plane to Mogadishu. And I told her I can't imagine that because I just can't. These deportations are impacting U.S. citizen families across this country. It's obvious that these deportations to Somalia will lead to the persecution and hardships of hundreds of deported Somalis. And it is, the United States has a moral and political obligation to avoid returning refugees to areas of extreme conflict. These deportations are violating international laws and that seek to protect folks who come here as refugees, So we've urged ICE to hold to all deportations to Somalia and to increase transparency for those affected by deportations that have been on previous flights. And I will conclude there, but I just want to say I'm so glad that we're having this conversation and talking about this and making sure that, we all do something about it. And I think King County did the right thing by ordering an executive order, but I think there's more that can be done, and it feels good to see this room full and with folks who want to do something about this, and I'm happy to talk about this more on the panel. Thanks.
How's everybody doing? Everybody feeling all right? April is Khmer New Year month, so I just, want to say Susadai Shnam Tumai, which means Happy New Year. So Happy New Year to everybody. And also, it's my girlfriend's birthday, and I made her come here with me. So happy birthday, baby! Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody, for sharing this space with me. I'm so honored to be here and to be able to be one of the folks presenting and speaking and sharing with you guys today. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to some of the affected community members that are in here. I see several in here, so I'm blessed that you guys came out to hear and then listen, and I appreciate that. As I was introduced earlier, a 1.5 generation Cambodian American. I came to the U.S. When I was 10 months old in 1981. I was born in a refugee camp where most Cambodians were processed through on the Thai border called Kawidang. And we fled basically the fallout of a conflict that the U.S. was also involved in related to the Vietnam War that resulted in the Cambodian genocide, which every Cambodian person here in the U.S. has experienced in some way, shape, or form, whether directly or through trauma that has been passed down. I volunteer for an organization called the Khmer Anti-Deportation Advocacy Group of Washington, and we're pretty new. We formed in late summer of last year, early fall, late summer of last year, as a reaction to one of the many ICE raids into the community. At that time, locally, there were 7 Khmer American folks that were picked up in the Seattle-Tacoma area. And I'm personally new to, although I have lived experiences and a lot of relationships with folks that have been affected or know people that have been deported, I think I am pretty new to the directly being involved in the struggle. Other core organizers and volunteers for the organization, however, have been in the struggle for years. During a time where there wasn't much resources and much access to institutions or knowledge of how to traverse something that marginalized communities really have no power over. So we came together to support impacted family members and to really let them know that they really have power if they're able to come together and be on the front lines to support. Because, Cambodians have been getting deported since 2002, and what we've learned over the years is that some of the most effective ways to advocate for community members is by being out there and being vocal and having family support. I think oftentimes a lot of people deal with this by themselves in the shadows. In the community, sometimes people don't want to deal with the fact that family members have been incarcerated or family members are going through this for a myriad of reasons, including shame or whatnot. But we came together to really try to break that thought and let them know that there are community members out here that really want to help. I think it took this long because, again, as a community as small as the Khmer Cambodian community, we've really, again, struggled to find our place and how do we fight as small as we are against such a big institution that is part of this bigger system that profits off of oppression and the incarceration of community members. So I'll talk a bit more about the organization in a bit, but I just wanted to kind of go over, my short version of how Cambodians got here. Cambodian Americans in Washington State, we arrived here primarily in the 1980s during the 80s wave of refugees from countries like Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, includes ethnic communities like the Cham, Hmong, Me, and the Khmu people. There's probably, depending on where you look, there's probably between 23 and 26,000 people that identify as Cambodian Americans that live in Washington State. Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett are places. Most Cambodian folks that I run into are from a province in the northwest of the country called Battambang. And reason being, and this is my hunch, is that Battambang is right next to the refugee camps. So a lot of times, at least in the Northwest, you'll run into people that are from that province. When we came, we were settled. I think we were settled in really economically marginalized places. So earlier in the introduction, I put that on my Holly baby, and I lived there until I was 10 in Holly Park, the predecessor to what is New Holly today. Park Lake Homes, which is now Greenbridge, was a really big community of Cambodians in White Center. High Point, which still exists, Rainier Vista, and then in Tacoma, the Salishan projects, and then Parkside and Everett. So those are really where large pockets of Cambodian Americans stayed at and arrived and built lives. And again, these are really economically marginalized areas. So that made us really susceptible to being fed into the school to prison pipeline, to being fed into the prison industrial complex. And it's no wonder that the way the community sees it is that incarceration and deportation are almost like one and the same, right? A lot of community members get ICE detainers put on them, regardless of how long they've served time. Before they even step foot outside, ICE picks them up. So I say all this to say that, the idea of resettlement is something I think the community is really trying to still realize. Because of the marginalization, I don't quite think that we have been able to really resettle. And we're still in a state of suspension. And being deported is taking us back to a place that was, bombed heavily, that a lot of folks had to deal with genocide at. So, the Nixon administration began incursions into Cambodia in the late 60s, early 70s, secretly, and at the time Cambodia was a neutral country. They also had bombing operations to kind of try to disrupt Vietnamese troops that were coming into Cambodia. So these were among several different campaigns that, if you think about it, are war crimes. This was done without the knowledge of Congress. This was done on a neutral country. What happened because of those incursions and because of the bombings, it created a power vacuum. The Khmer Rouge guerrillas that eventually took over in 1975 were really small throughout the 60s, but used the bombing as propaganda. I recently reunited with an aunt. When I was born in the refugee camps, my mom was too malnourished to produce breast milk. So one of my aunts that happened to have a son around the same time was the one that breastfed me. And we lost contact with her after coming to the US, and we recently reunited with her a couple years ago. And she grew up in a part of the country, Svai Reng, which is next to Vietnam, which saw a brunt of the bombing. And one of the first things I asked her upon meeting her was about that, so how was it when you were younger? And then she starts, talking about it, whole families gone, kids swimming in the bomb, the blowout, the craters that the bombs created. So, because of those things, the Khmer Rouge was able to use that as propaganda and swell its ranks. In April 17th, 1975 is when the Khmer Rouge rolled into the capital Phnom Penh, and many Cambodian Americans recognize that as the day, as the beginning of the Cambodian genocide. I think just last week, the Khmer Student Association here held a vigil called 44 Years of Resilience to, reflect on that date, but also to celebrate the resilience of the Khmer community here. In 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and thus freed people from the genocide, which for my family, my mom made her way over to Thailand where I was born. And Jimmy Carter signed the 1980s Refugee Act, which allowed for Cambodians, for Vietnamese, and for Lao folks to come over en masse as refugees. Since then, however, our status has kind of been chipped away most Cambodian folks are green card holders. And I think, again, not having institutional knowledge, not having institutional power to really realizing that green card doesn't mean like your permanent resident status doesn't mean you're a permanent resident. So a lot of Cambodian folks didn't know that. We just assumed, including myself, didn't assume that having a green card was just like citizenship. And then in 1996, the Clinton administration signed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, two really two pieces of legislation that really changed the status of Cambodian Americans and like communities like us. Some of the features of these two laws are broadening the definition of deportable offenses, which included misdemeanors like shoplifting or fishing without a license, the elimination of judicial discretion, a judge's ability to consider like extenuating factors like if removing somebody would disrupt the family's economic livelihood. Keep in mind that a lot of Khmer Cambodian communities, the main breadwinner is male, and the male is usually the head of household. So that legislation was kind of the beginning of this process to put us into the crosshairs for removal. Earlier, I talked about how the community is really was really vulnerable and susceptible to, the school to prison pipeline and incarceration. So concurrently during those times, I think a lot of politicians were running on the Tough on Crime platform. In our communities, there was a lot of, again, we were in housing projects and economically disadvantaged communities. There were a lot of gangs. There's a lot of folks getting into trouble. So we saw a lot of community members in the 90s disappear into the criminal justice system. Then 9/11 happens. And when 9/11 happens, the U.S. government starts putting a lot of pressure on governments to take back folks that were originally from said countries. And in this case, in Cambodia, as a result of 9/11, the U.S. forced Cambodia into signing an MOU to take back Cambodian folks. So in the 90s, Cambodian folks were already receiving orders of removal, but since Cambodia wasn't taking anybody back, a lot of folks just languished in immigration prisons. So starting in 2002, people started to be deported. And since then, the community has really just kind of tried to figure its way around and figure this thing out. Being such a small community, nobody really hears the stories of Cambodians being deported. I think oftentimes community members or people in public are a lot more sympathetic to a story of a woman on the southern border being that had committed no crime, whereas in the Khmer community, the reason a lot of folks are being deported is because they have these old order removals from the 90s. So since then, we've been really trying to struggle how to figure out how to deal with this, because today, most folks that are being deported have orders of removals from the 90s. So 20 years later, they've came out, they've changed their lives, they've had families, they have jobs, they have businesses, and all of a sudden, they get picked up and taken away just like that. Just to kind of paint a picture of how Cambodian Americans are kind of lost in the shuffle and kind of hidden. I think, I don't know if a lot of people have heard the model minority myth. I think we suffer a lot from that because a lot of data isn't disaggregated, and people see us as kind of folks that kind of benefit from the system. But looking back at some statistics from Washington State Cambodian folks, 82% of Cambodian American students qualify for free lunch. 60% live in a single parent home. 40.5% speak English less than well compared to 8% of the total. And this is data from 2013 through CRAC, which is a national organization that I'm focused on Southeast Asian communities. 37% have less than a high school degree. 14% with a bachelor's compared to the national average of almost 30%. And then within the Asian American community, 49%. I say all this to say that we really haven't been we're really a community that hasn't been able to really set our foot down and really plan ourselves the way a lot of communities have had. So that combined with the fact that we're not seen or we're not heard makes us really susceptible to being treated this way by ICE. It's kind of no surprise that I think the U.S. government pushed Cambodia to accept an MOU first and foremost. So what does that all mean? So deportation in the Khmer community still continues. There's an estimated 200 in the Washington state that are in danger of removal, 1,900 nationally. And I know those are small numbers compared to other communities, but we're a really small community in itself. Almost 2,000 folks have been deported since the MOU has been established. Looking at the report that team here has compiled in the ERO line item. 29 folks were deported in 2017, and then that jumped to 110 last year. That's a really big jump from 29 to 110. And 29, I don't have the average in front of me, but that was kind of the normal amount of total deportations nationwide. Most of the people that are affected are people with old orders of deportation, and it's nobody that, I can't say nobody, but a lot of folks are folks that are just have been checking in for decades, and it's became part of their lives, and that's just routine, and then one day they just get picked up. So what is CAGE doing now? So CAGE, or the Khmer Anti-Deportation Advocacy Group of Washington, came together, as I said earlier, last summer, fall, and we kind of, came together and really tried to put our heads together and leverage resources. As I said before, some organizers and volunteers are affected community members that have been doing the work for a very long time. Some of the folks are sitting in office or have relationships in the governor's office. Some folks, like myself, have relationships in press. So 7 folks were picked up last year, and we were able to directly help 2 folks not be put on the plane. And so that involved working with Governor Inslee's office. For the first time in Washington State history, we were able to, Governor Inslee skipped over the clemency and pardons process totally, and released a man named Ruth Ann. The first time that's ever been done in Washington State, and because he was days away from being put on a plane. I saw family members that usually don't come out stand up for their loved ones, and I'm not sure if she's here, but she told me she was going to be here. But there's a community member who when we figured out that nothing was going to happen through the governor's office, we went to the press, and she stepped up and got in front of the camera and told her story. And so these are the type of things we're doing, right? Like before that, we weren't really sure how to do things or what the strategy would be. But now we've kind of, came together and tried to leverage all the resources we have through press, through relationships. And that's still happening, right? We still don't have answers per se, but we're still working on it. I think that some strategies going forward are continuing to leverage partnerships on a national level and to try to pivot to a more proactive approach and not depend on pardons all the time, which is a really taxing process, to let community members know that there is a process that you can do. It's for folks that are facing orders of removal, it's always better to take a look at pardons or undoing certain things that make your case deportable. I think there was another gentleman that he didn't know, but when he came to see us, we were able to put him with pro bono legal advocates that helped undo his charge in the first place, because he had pled guilty to a crime that he didn't know he would be deportable for. So it's a really messy process, but we are beginning to put together a structure that can help folks navigate this system. Locally, there has been 4 Cambodian Americans that have been pardoned. Nationally, 15. Next steps. I think was it Task Force D? Task Force D. Thank you so much, because that's a prime example of people in a position of privilege or with institutional power that can make a difference. And I think in terms of what anybody can do, it's just that. A few months ago, Dina Bernstein, who's with the Interfaith Migrants' Rights Network, she showed up through direct action to be at ICE facilities when somebody was turning themselves in. Again, a lot of times it's support for folks that think they're by themselves. So implore folks here that if they want to make a difference, a lot of times it's just, in your own space and in your own zone. These flights take off because a lot of folks think they're just a cog in the wheel, and they're just like, I can't do anything about it. I'm just a guy that flies a plane or just takes out the garbage or whatever the case may be. What is it that you can do in your own space if not directly engage or come into the scene? Because really, what we're trying to do is really liberate ourselves, and we can't liberate ourselves if we can't liberate everybody. So, if someone was to ask me what you could do, I'd really say that. A lot of folks in privileged position are white, and just look at the space that you have, and look at your ability to pull the levers and see what you can do within your space, because those things just can echo across spaces. That's as much as I have. Sorry for rambling on. But before I go, I just want to acknowledge Manny Uch in the building. He's one of the core organizers, and he's an affected community member who was, been going through this process since the 90s. And the good news is that his order of deportation has been finally lifted. So congratulations, Manny. Thank you.
Good evening. Hi. My name is Maru Mora Villalpando, and yay, that's me. And I'm part of La Resistencia, formerly known as NWDC Resistance. We made it easy for all of you to remember our name, La Resistencia. So I want to start by saying, yes, thank you to the collaboration with Angelina and all the students. I think this report, it shows when groups and people come together in a respectful, professional, committed way. We've been working with Angelina for some years now, and we've done some projects, and this is one of those that it was better than we expected. So, and I want to make sure that when we think of deportation flights, we remember that we're talking about detention and deportations all together throughout the nation. And as it was mentioned at the beginning, our work as La Resistencia is to end all detentions and all deportations, period. But we're going to focus right now on King County flights. So everybody knows King County said that they're sanctuary, Seattle is sanctuary, yet we still see so many deportations being happening here in King County Airport, as the report just presented. We see that Dow Constantine, the same person that surprisingly set up a press conference yesterday without telling really any of us, that he has some zero youth detention policy, yet we have this large building in 12th and Lander that they're building to incarcerate youth. That's why I'm wearing this. And we have these offices in 1212 Avenue. Actually, it's 1002nd Avenue. Sorry, that's messed up. 1002nd Avenue. And we continue hearing of ICE going outside courthouses and arresting people. So how can we say that we actually are in a sanctuary county, in a sanctuary city, that supposedly we also have a renewed executive order from Inslee himself in 2017, and we still see a state patrol stopping people and sending them to ICE during a traffic stop. So all of this is hypocrisy. And so we cannot continue saying that this is a sanctuary city, a sanctuary county, or a sanctuary state whatsoever, when the reality shows completely different situations. The most surprising thing about all the data and all the information that the students and Angelina got was the fact that when people are deported, they're not seen as passengers because they didn't buy a ticket. No. So you hear like Ralph Nader talking about passenger rights, right? Well, because you bought your ticket. But in our case, if we get deported, we're not even seen as passengers, we're seen as cargo. Talk about slavery coming back. And I just grabbed pictures from the internet. Really didn't take me long to find pictures of the shackles. There's a ton of them. And that shows you how common this is. It's just incredible the level of violence that our families are going through, that individuals are going through when deportation happens. This picture caught my eye, and I'm sorry, it's not like really good quality. Again, I just grabbed it from the internet. But see how this person getting into the plane is just, facing down? This is kind of what we face when we get calls from the detention center and when we talk to families. ICE is expecting us to just look down, to give up, to just do whatever they tell us, to believe what they tell us. So there's constant violence, physical violence, but there's also the violence of constant oppression that we've been facing for so many centuries, and that ICE has so many easy ways to inflict upon us, that even on the way out, people still feel there's no solution to our problems, that somehow we deserve this. And this is happening here in King County. I think that for us, when we start looking at deportation flights, the first thing we thought was, well, what about international human rights? What about that? Doesn't that apply? Well, we've done a lot of work with Professor Alejandra Gonza, that is here from the International Human Rights Clinic, and we were just celebrating that the work that we've done with her show now the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights did that report recently in the testimonies that we have presented, thanks to her work and her students here at the UW. But then it makes you wonder, aren't we supposed to be accountable also to the international community? Well, yeah, it makes you laugh because it seems that we're not. Yet, Alejandra and I were talking this morning, and usually the US had been seen in the past by the international community as the place where human rights are held, right? That the access to information is available. And this is the first time, through this work of the Center for Human Rights and International Human Rights Clinic, we're showing no, the United States is not that place. Even we say that to people detained when they call us, especially people from Cuba. They call us and they say, they told me this is the land of freedom, and I've been detained for so many months. And I say to them, well, they lied to you. So what we see as La Resistencia, our work is to expose the machine, right? Is to expose all these lies, is to expose how the machine is sustained by an infrastructure that relies on localities. So let me give you an example. June of 2018, the June 3rd of 2018, I believe, we decided to shut down 2nd Avenue. Some people got stuck in traffic, and well, aren't you stuck in traffic in Seattle anyway? All the time. So no, I don't know why people complain about it that day. But we did it because we believed that we needed to call attention to the fact that ICE is in 1000 2nd Avenue, Homeland Security Investigations is there, and they continue working with Seattle Police Department. But supposedly they're not. So we decided to do this. We shut down the street, we got this action happen, there were arrests, people were released that day. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, there's the news that families have been separated at the border and 200 women have been sent to SeaTac. So we decided to switch our Solidarity Day that happens every month at SeaTac. We switched that happens at NWDC, we switched to SeaTac. So we had less than 48 hours to put everything together. We have never done a Solidarity Day there. Have people been at the SeaTac Federal Detention Center? Some, okay. So it's very challenging to do actions there because there's no a space for pedestrians. SeaTac is also a city known that the mayor is a Trump lover. I think somebody called them that way. That SeaTac police does collaborate with ICE as well. So we were facing the challenge of we're going to do an action, we don't know how many people are going to show, and we don't know if there's going to be arrests. So we really had to do a lot of work to ensure that we were able to provide safety to people that arrived. What we didn't know, and we announced, we're going on Saturday, 1:30, show up. What we didn't know is that all these politicians, these famous people in Seattle, decided to do a press conference before us. So we called an action at 1:30, they show up at noon without telling us. Same thing as yesterday, without telling us. So it's this idea of, are they just taking advantage of us? Do they like the photo op? I believe so. Yes, thank you for agreeing with me. And so while we had 9 courageous people shutting down the street, being arrested, released the same day on Tuesday with no charges. Then we have these politicians showing up on Saturday, including Dan Constantine, saying, I'm going to do everything in my power to stop the deportation flights in King County. And we're like, oh, how? Then we didn't hear anything, crickets, right? For months, crickets. And at the same time as we're exposing this machine, what happens is that in the city of Seattle, the city attorney decides to set charges against the 9 people that shut down the street. So right now we're facing that. You know, we have politicians showing up to a CTAC action saying we are really progressive, we won't let this happen. And instead of fighting the deportation machine, instead of fighting the infrastructure that Trump is taking advantage of, they decide to fight us. And they decide to put charges against our people, and they don't want to drop them. So we continue exposing this machine. And we have actually worked with several groups, and some of you are present here, throughout the state, on how this machine operates not only in King County. We know that now Jackie might supposedly know detaining people, supposedly, because they were made not to, because they lost a lawsuit, but they're still doing it. Montserrat is like, yeah, of course, we know. And this is a graphic that we put together last year because we wanted to showcase this is not only a Seattle problem, right? It's a Washington state problem. But how deep it goes, we still don't know. But we need to make sure that people are aware of what's happening and how each of those localities are responsible for those numbers, right? For every person that's a life is disrupted, those localities has to do something with it, and they should be also held accountable, not only ICE. But in our experience with this report and trying to engage with King County authorities, what we'll learn is that localities just pass the buck. Let me give you an example. This is a sign that was in the door of the entrance to the Northwest Detention Center last year in September. Can you all read this? It's a warning. If you come in, you might be exposed to chickenpox. So if you want to come in, that's your problem. So in the NWDC, we had 2 outbreaks of chickenpox last year, one right after the other one, and then mumps. And we went to city of Tacoma and said, this is happening, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, that's Gio's problem. And if you talk to Gio, they're like, that's ICE problem. And if ICE, they blame everybody else. And so you talk to the Department of Health, they're like, we're only if Gio let us in, but last inspection they had, everything was fine. They don't have to report anything to us if they don't want. So they're really good at just, passing the buck. And it felt the same way with King County, because it turns out like even if you read the executive order, they're like, we didn't know. We just didn't know. June 2018, all of a sudden, what? There's deportations? What? How did that happen? Let me tell you, in 2014, when we did our first shutdown action, that was February 24 of 2014. That was a Tuesday. There was a reason why we did it on a Tuesday. Because that's the day deportations happen. And we're talking about 2014 when we came up with this. And it's 2019, and you ask the county, and they say, what? Deportations happen on Tuesday? We had no idea. So, I think that we're used to having to deal with localities that don't want to face reality, but it makes us angry when they think that we're stupid, because we're not. And we're angry, and I think you should be angry too. This is the statement of a good friend of mine that I met in the detention center, Ricardo. He used to call me almost every day, and he had horrible medical problems, still does. He was deported. But sometimes, and most of the times that he called me, he never talked about his own problems. He would talk about other people's problems, right? And so what he kept saying to me was, how do we stop all this? You know, when I leave this place, I want to join Resistencia, but how do we do it? He ended up being deported. And as this report was being put together, we were able to locate him. He's been in touch with us. And he said to me, can I share my story? I think that's the least I can do, and I should do. So this is a quote from him. He's pretty much describing things were horrible in the detention center. I can tell you so many stories about him and his medical condition. But to say, even the deportation process in itself, the flight, is also horrible. Like, why? We're already leaving. Why do you have to treat us this way? His deportation flight, in summary, was 3 stops. In every stop, they have to get off from the plane and come back because they were adding more people as every stop happened. And he was handcuffed like everybody else. And as you come back into the plane, he said, every time guards will tell us, you're scum of the earth. You're trying to take our jobs. I'm so glad you're leaving my country. I don't want to see you ever again. And those are the nice way I can put it and the way they talk to him. So every time they were brought into the airplane, they were the same kind of humiliation they had to go through. So it was 3 stops. And then there was a layover for a night in what he described a detention center inside an airport. And then in the morning at 5:30, goes into the plane again for another 3 stops, and then finally to his destination. So that really took 2 days for him to go from the US to El Salvador, all the way there. As people were talking about the Somalia nightmare of that flight that we know, we actually were in touch with a person that was in that flight, a person that was here in Tacoma from Somalia. He was deported there, and he called us back when that flight came back to Miami. So he called us and he said, "You have no idea what I just went through." And I was like, "I think I just read it." So he told us, he told us the entire hours, how they were lied, the reasons why they were sitting there for so many hours, why they came back. And all I can tell you, what is stuck in my mind, that the textual part that is stuck in my mind was, he said it was like hell in the sky. That's how he described it. So if we know all the violence that our communities are going through, we know how this violence is being inflicted upon us. If anybody reads the report or sees this, they would be shocked. But how easy it is to talk about things that you're gonna do, but how hard it's actually to do so. So this is a quote from the press release that was sent out yesterday from Daud Constantine press conference. And he says that, they're gonna attempt to do something, and that we are welcoming to all people. How nice that looks like. But what are the actions? And I'm glad that Angelina explained in very simple ways how those action is going to look like. We don't know. It's not clear. So I don't know you, but I mean, people can talk and talk and talk. I'm more of an action person, and I think most of you know that. In our group, that's what we do, right? We only get to talk like this when we're invited. Usually we don't. But let me tell you that even if somehow, that there's a bill that just passed and is going to be signed by the governor called the Keep Washington Working Bill. It's a bill that actually, it took 7 years to get to this point. We started back in 2012 and, with Democrats in power, and it still took us 7 years. See how frustrated I am with politicians? So as this is signed and hopefully implemented, because we'll still have to see the implementation, that does not guarantee that this detention center won't have people being brought into King County Airport to be detained. Because as of now, at least half of the population in NWDC are people that were detained in the southern border. So if this bill actually is implemented and we see less detentions in Washington State, we will see an increase of people being brought to the airport in Boeing Field to be detained because they're coming from the southern border. So I think that's really critical to understand. And let me just give you a hint of how things are in WDC right now. Since March 15, we have received at least 14 reports of maggots in the food. So for over a month now, we have constant reports of people saying that beans, chicken, and fruit, they constantly find maggots alive. So because we asked, so how do you know, have you seen them? How do they look like? And they said, well, they're moving. I look at my beans and something was moving in it. Somebody just cut a piece of chicken and they were there. And so I asked a woman one day, like a week ago or so, have you seen maggots? Of course, we're asking now everybody, right? Have you seen maggots? And she said, yeah. And do you remember when that happened? Just this morning. Where did you find them? In the fruit. But that's not once in a while we get them. What we get all the time in the food is hairs. And so that is what people are facing in the detention center right now. Let me remind you, NWDC is supposed to be the top facility across the nation. ICE sells this place as their top facility in the nation. So imagine how the rest of them are. And why it's so critical for us to help people like Doug Constantine accountable to his words. Because, excuse me, but if you're gonna talk about my community, and if you open your mouth, you better do what you say you're gonna do. Otherwise, we're gonna keep you in check, and don't start crying when we're coming after you. As Dow Constantine was having a press conference at 3 p.m. in King County Airport, I went to the detention center and I took these pictures. This is the parking lot where buses and their patrols are sitting throughout the day. Usually that's full. If you ever been to the detention center, you will see that at least 5 buses like those two right there on the right. Yes, you're right. Usually there's 5 of them, but there were only 2 there. And there's all other smaller buses. But as you can see, that's full. I was driving as I took these, so they're not like the best pictures. So I tried to zoom in, and there they are, just those buses, and I realized, okay, yeah, it's Tuesday, it's Deportation's Day. So as he was speaking, it was a deportation day. How many people were taken from NWDC to be deported? And the case that we don't see enough buses there tells you where are those buses, right? And so as I was leaving the detention center, I saw another bus coming in, and I turned around and I tried to catch another picture of it. So that bus that you see there kind of turning around, it tells us that it's empty because it's going into the parking lot. So these buses were leaving King County Airport and coming back into the detention center empty. Today, one of our colleagues went back again, and she saw buses leaving the parking lot, which means now they're going to go get new people from other places to bring into the detention center. Because that detention center, as it was mentioned, it has a minimum guarantee of 800 beds. The maximum capacity is 1,575. It's not convenient for us just to bring 800 people, right? So they keep it at capacity. And so that's another shot just to show you that pretty much is empty and the bus is going in. So what is that we're asking for? Like I say, we are finding again and again how private corporations benefit from our misery. Again and again, GEO is one of them. It was mentioned, all these new names that we have to learn, Modern, Air, and what was the other one? Clay Lacy. Remember that, because you're going to need to remember that. And so for them to operate, they need the local infrastructure. Otherwise, they won't be able to operate. And so what we want King County is to stop colluding with gross violations of people's humanity. Because they are. They can claim they didn't know. Let's say they actually didn't know. It doesn't matter. They're doing it. And that's the problem. And if they didn't know, well, they know now. So let me tell you, when Angelina and us started looking at all this data, we realized this was something huge that we needed to do. La Resistencia, we're all volunteers. We have a lot of work to do. Good thing that hunger strikes have not happened this year here in Tacoma, but we have been supporting hunger strikes in other places across the nation. But we realized that, there was no coincidence that we do a shutdown of the street outside ICE offices in downtown, then the announcement of the zero tolerance policy, and then politicians coming out and talking about, how horrible that is. I think that what we want to make sure is that if any county official, any elected official really feels bad about this, they really believe this is horrible, they should be working with us. They should not just taking advantage. This shouldn't be a photo moment, right? I think that it was clear for us in that press conference and the executive order is that there was an urgency. Yes, we agree there's an urgency, but it's different, the type of urgency. The urgency that Dow Constantine found himself in and the urgency that we find ourselves in. We want a concrete plan, how this is going to happen. And we want a real timeline. By when? Because as it was found in the little access that Angelina had to information, it turns out that contracts, or these agreements, they're called agreements, with these companies that are leasing these spaces in the airport last 35 years. And one of the main ones, Clay Lacy, lasts for 35 years. And according to the little information that we have, it was recently renewed. So when Dow Constantine says that he's banning these leases, by when? Are we going to wait 35 years? Sorry, we can't wait that long. So we want a real timeline to end those leases. And we want full transparency on details, because something that we realized that the little information that King County was giving, it was also the fact that either they didn't know or they don't want to know. Either way, there should be a transparent process to all of this. And how come they're announcing audits now? How come they didn't do it in the past? I mean, it's just obvious that something had to be done there. And they have to understand that we cannot allow for expansion or new permits if these deportation flights are going to actually end. I think that for us, going back to the emergency for us is that this week is 15 years since the detention center opened. This week. 15 years is too many years. To me, it sounded that Dow Constantine's urgency is his image and his political career. And that is not something that we're going to allow. We're asking you to help us in ensuring that what the county actually does, if they do it, should follow these specific demands. How do we do it? Well, as I say, we are people of action. And what we're asking you to do is to call him. Call Dow Constantine. There's the phone number. 206-263-9600. I'm going to repeat that for all of you. 206-263-9600. There's a voicemail. We tested it. It works. I think it still today works. We tested it last night. Call him and tell him, we don't want to wait 35 years for this to happen. We're giving you 35 days. And we're being Really nice. 35 days, starting today. So make sure that let us know if they answer the phone. Let us know if you were able to leave a voicemail. Let us know if they get back to you or something. Tell him, we're counting the days. You have 35 days. No more, no less. We're being nice. We could have said less again, but we're going to stick with the 35. Because again, as he was speaking, people had already took off from King County to be deported. Just now, when one of the panelists were speaking, I was getting a text from a family member saying, my son is getting deported next week. So this is something that should have been done years ago. Doug Constantine should not wait for his political career to take off. If he really, truly cares about this, he would have done it on June 2018. But why did he wait for the day before of this release of this report? I think that that's easy to understand. So, thank you.